Morning, everybody. Want to wish everybody happy Mother's Day. Today's a really cool day to celebrate moms. So I'm looking forward to this afternoon and this evening. My wife has no clue what I have planned for Mother's Day. I asked her a few weeks ago, what do you want to do for Mother's Day? And she hummed and hawed, and I'm like, uh-oh, because now I'm thinking, what do I do? And, I'm a guy, I need ideas. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to create a plan. So I did. And I informed Jen last week. I said, I have a plan for Mother's Day, so you don't have to worry about telling me what you want to do. And all of a sudden, the ideas started coming. Making sure that I have my list, the same list as hers. So we've got a great day planned for you, Jen. Don't worry about it at all. McDonald's is just not that far away. I'm kidding. We're not going to McDonald's. That's one restaurant she doesn't like to go to, so we won't go there. Anyways, before I get into my message, I just want to bring before you, and I want to keep bringing it before you, is a few weeks ago we had our vision meeting here at our church, and we had over 100 people stay, where we asked 6 questions about the future of our church, our values, and what God has been speaking to you about. We were praying for weeks and weeks before that, asking God, what is it that you want to do here at Crossfield Baptist Church? What do you want us to do? What do you want us to become? What's your direction? We want to be in God's will. I think it's a wonderful thing to know when you're living in God's will. You don't worry about the direction you're headed when you're in God's will. And so that's what we've been pursuing. And so you've answered those questions. We got together. We had some papers on the walls over the last couple of weeks you were able to go look at. That was some of the answers to some of the questions. And just so you know, it does take time to put all of the results of all of the questions from about 100 people into a nice little chart and list and everything. So I'm working at it. I'm getting there. But the results of that will come out once I get that all done. And so that's coming, but just keep in prayer. There's lots of information, and there's lots of ideas, and sometimes it can be a little difficult to discern the will of God, can't it? Anybody else have trouble discerning God's will from time to time? And so we're going to bring that information before you, and we're going to pray, we're going to decide, and we're going to move forward. Now that I got my little announcement out of the way, let's get back to celebrating the joy of moms. So this morning, I am going to talk a little bit. I often don't know what to preach on Mother's Days. Like, what do I say? I'm not a mother. I'm not really sure what it's like to be one. I am a dad, so I know what that's like. Maybe that's somewhat similar. There are some commonalities, I'm sure. But what do I say to you? What do I say as a dad to moms? And I'll just go to the Bible and hope for the best. And so I have this morning, I titled my message, Listening to Mom. This is something I think is very important. It's something that I watched as a dad. Jen homeschooled our children, and so they had to learn how to see mom as mom and mom as teacher and dad as principal, and they got sent to my office, which was actually fun for me. And one of the things I was amazed at is how well Jen was able to encourage our children to listen. Listening is such an important skill. Last week, if you were here, you will remember that I preached on the subject about listening to God. How do we learn to listen to God? How do we hear His voice? That still small voice. And so I led you in understanding that one of the ways that we do that is by going into the Scriptures and reading His Word, meditating upon it, chewing upon it, and learning to listen. And listening is so important. Today, we're looking at moms. And so while this message is going to be maybe aimed a bit towards those who are children, the message of listening to mom is for us all. A mom once told the story. After moving to the country, my 3-year-old daughter and I were often alone in our house. And because we lived in a rural area with no close neighbors, I wanted to make sure my daughter would be able to call 911 in the event that something happened to me. And after instructing her, I decided to test her. Okay, what would you do if you found me on the floor and you couldn't wake me up? And I could see her little brain working. And to my surprise, she finally said, I would go into the kitchen and eat anything I want. Kids are amazing. It's just priceless, some of the things the kids say. It really is. And sometimes the kids listen and sometimes they don't. Sometimes we listen and sometimes we don't. And listening can be hard to do, including and sometimes especially listening to our mom. In fact, as I was reading and researching for this message, you would not believe how often I came across this statement. If a woman speaks and no one listens, her name is probably Mom. I mean, it's a bit sobering, but maybe moms can relate. Last week, we learned a little bit about listening to God, and I'm hoping that we can understand that the spiritual discipline of listening is something that we practice every day, and not just to God, but listening to others. Listening is something that is often overrated, or I should say underrated. My mistake. I'm getting it the other way. Listening is so important. How many here like to talk? Anybody here love to chat? You don't want to raise your hands now because we're talking about listening, right? I get that. Yeah, I know I'm setting you up. No, I'm kidding. Listening is one of those things. Now, I'm going to read off some statistics, and I want you to pick one or two of those statistics and chat about it over lunch. And you will know which ones are the ones you want to chat about because they are the ones that stand out to you. And there's some interesting ones, okay? Here we go. Active listening increases collaboration and productivity by up to 25%. That sounds like a great positive statistic, doesn't it? Here's another one. Over 50% of managers do not listen effectively to their employees. Some of you might be agreeing to that and say, yeah, that's exactly it. Active listening reduces misunderstandings by 40%. Ever have a misunderstanding? Sure. On average, people spend 45% of their communication time on listening. Only 45% of their communication time on listening. That means something else is happening more than listening. Interesting. 80% of all workplace complaints and conflicts largely stem from poor communication. 80%. So, let's take a look at some other types of statistics. What's the average speaking rate of a human being? Some people are chattier than others, but on average, the typical person utters anywhere from 125 to 175 words per minute. That's quite fast. But your ears, how many can they listen to? Your ears work a little faster than your mouth, actually. The average number of words you'll probably be able to listen to per minute is about 450. But how much of that is absorbed? So even though your ears are capable of picking up on so many words, your brain doesn't necessarily process all of them. Most people usually only remember about 17 to 25% of the things they listen to. I want you to think about that one for a moment because I'm going to get into a statistic here that doesn't speak well of me here in a moment as a guy. Sorry, guys, I got to share this one. This is great. But 17 to 25% of what was said will be remembered. Now, this is important as a pastor because I read a statistic a long time ago that approximately 80% of my sermon today will be forgotten by you by the time you leave those doors. 80%. I'm like, well, why do I bother? No, I'm kidding. I just don't know which 80% is important to you, right? Or not important to you. And then the next one is even better. 90% of my message today will be forgotten by the time you get home. So I'm hoping one of these statistics will be remembered. Here's the one about guys and girls. Are men or women better listeners? Any guesses? Who think guys are better listeners? Who thinks women are better listeners? Oh, look at this. Oh my goodness. Okay, here we go. This is great. Research shows that men only use half their brain to listen. I'm sorry, guys. while women engage with both sides. And so, ladies, if you are constantly feeling like your spouse is not listening and is tuning you out, they are. Yeah, science proves it, and it's the way we're wired. It's not a choice, it's just there. It's in our heads. So we apologize ahead of time, but you married us. Now, you might be surprised to learn that your words only convey 7% of what you're trying to say. And the other 93% is communicated through facial expressions and the tone of your voice. So these statistics are interesting because, ladies, number one, you listen better than guys. You are able to process words better than guys, remember better than guys on these levels. And some of you might be chattier than others. But just remember that as you're conveying words, only 7% of that is actually what's being communicated. Or 7% of what you're communicating is words. 93% is everything else. Tone of voice, your body language, your micro expressions, all of that type of stuff. But remember, guys are getting about half of probably of what you're getting, ish. And so more words might not be the best thing. Hint, hint. But just saying that you could see how this causes problems in marriage, can't you? You can see how that can cause problems for children and their parents. And so as we reflect upon moms, these statistics all of a sudden become a little bit more important. But did you know that there are some side effects to listening? Listening to nagging or complaining for 30 minutes or more can cause damage to the part of your brain that handles problem-solving skills. This one, I think it's funny if you phrase it in different ways. Don't cause brain damage to people around you. Nagging and complaining causes brain damage. And so that's something for us to think about as we are living for Christ. And it says in the scriptures, and it's that verse I love to hate, do everything without complaining or arguing. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 14. It's hard to practice, but my goodness, it's so important. Oh, and by the way, if you put on some tunes while you are studying, you can potentially improve your grades, but only certain types of music. Studies show that listening to classical music while hitting the books has been linked to a 12% increase in math test scores. Math test scores and classical music. Those two go together. But, and these are for our teen drivers, Levi. When teens are behind the wheel, 98% of teens are likely to commit a driving error while listening to their favorite music. And that figure drops to 78% when they listen to something more relaxing, like soft rock. And think about that. When you're listening to your favorite music, teens have a 98% of them will commit a driver error. So when the police pull you over and say, have you been listening to music, you understand why they ask that first. They know you're listening to music, you're going to be distracted, you're not focused on the road. Listening's important. These statistics just show just a brief glimpse into how important it is. So you figure out which ones are important to you, talk about it over lunch today. So as we are moving forward here with my message, there's two passages of Scripture I want to read for us. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, and the second one is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 to 3. And this is what it says. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They are a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you, and that you may enjoy a long life on the earth. So point number one of my message today is listening to wisdom in Proverbs chapter 1, 8 to 9. Now, the setting of the book of Proverbs in these first bit here is basically what we can call homeschooling. And it's not the type of homeschooling that you might know about today, where you're going to study different literature, math, science, and all of the rest of it. This is about the lessons that come from living at home and watching your parents. This is the type of homeschooling that you and I are concerned about as we raise kids. They are watching us, and they're going to copy us. And all throughout the book of Proverbs, the author will write about different voices that a person can listen to. For instance, you're not supposed to listen to a fool or to the greedy or to a seductress. Rather, you are to listen to the wise, listen to wisdom, listen to your parents, and listen to the king. Now, I can't overstate how important the art of listening truly is. And in fact, if you want to be a good listener, maybe consider reading the book of Proverbs a few times. Proverbs are interesting. They are that little snippet of information, a little one or two liner that just kind of grabs your attention and makes your brain think. And it makes you stop and listen and think before you speak or act. That's what Proverbs do. For instance, if you poke a bear, you become lunch. Have you ever poked a bear? Will you become lunch? You know, if you stop and you pay attention to some of the proverbial sayings, there's some powerful truths in there. And so let me tell you a little bit of a story about the subject of listening, and I think this is a great story. Maybe you've experienced something like this. There was a lady, she worked at a mall, and over her lunch break, she went and she would often do shopping throughout the mall. And so this particular time, she was in the pharmacy. And so that's the setting of the story, is this lady who is on lunch break is in a pharmacy, minding her own business, when all of a sudden, bam, a lady runs into her. And we'll call this lady a female customer. A female customer said, "You, where do you keep your toilet paper?" And the lady said, "In my cupboard." And the customer said, "How dare you talk to me that way? I want to talk to your manager." "I'm sorry, I don't work here." The customer said, "Oh, so now you're going to get in trouble, and it's, I don't work here, eh?" And me pointing to the company logo on my shirt, the person said, "No, genuinely, I don't work here. See, this is where I work." And the customer said, "So you don't wear your uniform either. Where's your manager?" And so that particular lady, the female customer, turns to the makeup counter employee and says, "Are you her manager?" And the makeup counter employee says, yes, I am," and turns to the lady and just kind of winks at her and says, "Don't do that again." And then this female customer said, "See, thank you. See, now I can shop here again." And so she turns back to the female makeup counter employee and says, "You, where do you keep your toilet paper?" "In my cupboard." Probably didn't buy anything that day. But you see the story on how listening is helpful? How that story would have been totally boring if she actually paid attention to the fact that that wasn't an employee there in the store. Listening is really important. In fact, not listening will get you into trouble. Earlier in the statistics, you can see that miscommunication and misunderstandings leads most of the problems that you and I are going to face. And so that's why the author of Proverbs wants you and I to listen to our mothers. Our moms have lived more, experienced more things, gone through more trouble, carried more burdens, and solved more problems. She most definitely has something to offer us. So when it says that your mother's teachings are a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck, he's trying to get across that you are seen as wise because you've gained and followed your mother's teaching. Your life reveals to everyone whether or not you listen well. You know somebody who doesn't listen well, don't you? And I can safely say that a person who listens well is a person who will grow wise. And if we listen well, we can avoid much trouble, prevent much trouble, and offer grace to others as an example on how to live. And so to all of you mothers out there, thank you. Thank you for your teaching. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your grace. Now, we're going to move into the New Testament now, which is point number 2 of my message. Obedience because of Christ is what I titled it, from Ephesians 6, 1-3. And we're shifting from wisdom literature and the basic assumptions that he's saying in there, that moms have lots to offer their kids, and kids need to listen well to their mom. And as we moved in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul wrote this book of Ephesians, and he's giving more than just practical advice about listening to your parents and obeying your parents. He's got theological motivation why children, young children and old children, need to obey their parents. Namely, God wants you to listen to your parents. That's your theological motivation. God wants you to. Back in Paul's day, the culture was different. 2,000 years ago, a lot of things are very different. They had different house rules, as we'll call them, and there's a wide variety of them, and today I'm not going to get into all of them. But for instance, in those days, if they had slaves, which was permitted back then, the slaves were to obey. Wives back then were to submit and obey to their husbands because they were expected to follow even the gods that the husband believed in. And so you can easily see on how becoming a Christian would be problematic for women back in those ancient cultures, because Christianity taught that following Jesus was more important than family. And so Paul needed to explain, and Peter did as we studied 1 Peter a little while ago, had to explain how following the laws of the land and obeying and following and submitting to the authorities above us actually can produce a lot of good. And that we don't want to disturb the waters too much because we'll get into trouble. Children were to submit and obey to their parents. And all Christians were to submit and to obey the government. But why? A lot of us are asking the question, especially in recent years, isn't there a point where we wouldn't obey and would not listen? And I think that many people want to know where that boundary line is. But to understand that boundary line and to discern it well, we need to understand the theological motivation for obedience in the first place. And this is it. God wants us to submit and obey. The only time we do not submit and listen is when the authorities above us, whatever they are, tell us to live in a way that is contrary to God and His holiness. Paul's teaching here isn't different than the culture's teaching. Children need to obey their parents. That was expected. And the kids are saying, but why should I? And sometimes we say the same thing. In ancient culture, fathers had absolute authority over their family. They could even decide whether a child lived or died at birth. And so obedience was important for a child to stay alive and to be treated well. In the Old Testament, in Jewish culture, the command to honor one's parents was tied to a promise that they would have long life in the land of promise, which was the land of Israel. It was very contextual, though, so we need to understand what this promise meant, because as we're going to see, the promise can be easily misunderstood. This promise was more about the nation than it was about the individual. Paul uses this teaching to show that obedience to parents leads to order and stability. Klein Snodgrass, who is a commentator on this book, he says that the promise applies to the community and is not a guarantee to the individual. Now that's important because it's very easy for us to think individually in our culture. That promise is for me. If I obey my parents, I will get long life. Clearly, people who have lived in Israel and followed this command, and in earlier days with Christians who followed this command to obey their parents, did not all have long lives. Many who honored their parents died to disease, accidents, wars, and other unfortunate events. Rather, what this promise is saying is that the community as a whole was blessed because of it, and when you build up your community by honoring and obeying your parents, that creates stability and order, and you will have longer life that way. God's promised blessings to the community and to the family are motivation for obedience. And consider for a moment a family where the home life is horrible. Some of you have seen that. Some of you might have even lived that. How many stories have you heard of children not only who were not treated well, but on the other side where children were raised by Christian parents but didn't follow the teachings of their parents and walked away from the faith? Instability was a danger to ancient culture just as much as it is a danger to ours. And so the social fabric of any culture rises and falls on the relationship between parents and children. And mothers are a huge part of that social fabric. Billy Graham once said, "Children will invariably talk, eat, walk, think, respond, and act like their parents." Good luck, kids. Give them a target to shoot at, give them a goal to work toward, give them a pattern that they can see clearly, and you will give them something that gold and silver cannot buy. Paul tells us in the book of Ephesians to obey our parents in the Lord. And this is not saying that we only obey Christian parents. What this is actually saying is that being a Christian, Christians are to obey parents. You who are in the Lord are to obey your parents. And while this applies to both adults and children, Paul, as I mentioned, is most likely talking to the younger crowd here. And this is where solid parenting comes in. Moms get it right so often when they are nurturing rather than acting with uncontrolled anger, correcting rather than yelling, caring rather than shaming. So I want to thank you again, mothers, for your love and for the work that you do with your kids. Keep up the good job. And I do want to encourage you moms and the soon-to-be moms today. Being a mom isn't about perfectionism. It isn't about getting everything right. It isn't about having everything clean. It isn't about having your meals turn out like the chefs on TV, nor it is about making every appointment on time. So let me read to you a little excerpt from a book titled The Heart of Perfection, How the Saints Taught Me to Trade My Dream of Perfection for God's. And Colleen Campbell wrote this, and she said, "I never considered myself a perfectionist before I had children. Perfectionism was someone else's problem. It was the affliction of those pasty-faced library moles that haunted the campus stacks on Saturday nights, still cramming after everyone else had left to grab a beer. It was the curse of the hulking workout kings who passed entire spring days pumping and groaning in the mirror-lined mausoleum of the campus gym. Perfectionism was what made frazzled mothers stay up all night hand-sewing Halloween costumes, and that turned fathers into red-faced sideline screamers or workaholics who missed the game altogether. A perfectionist was that tortured soul who always seems to land in front of me in the salad bar line, the one who inspects each lettuce leaf as if sifting for gold and complains to the waiter about the radish shaving someone dropped in the fat-free ranch. That's a perfectionist, I thought, and that's not me." So how do you view being a mom? Let's conclude the message today. As I see it in the scriptures, a mother's job, while it has many facets, many facets, is about showing the love of God to their kids, raising them to live for Jesus. Not just so that they can go to heaven one day, which is what every parent wants, and that's awesome, but also that they become people who will in turn love others and train others to live for Jesus, just like their moms taught them. One grandfather wrote this story. When one of our grandsons was about 8 years old, he announced at a family gathering that I treat my wife like a queen. I puffed up with pride, and I asked him a follow-up question that I think was going to give me better stature. And I said, "Since I treat her like a queen, what does that make me?" And his immediate response was, "A servant." Today, I want to encourage everyone here to go and honor your moms. Some of our moms have gone before us, and so we remember them. but their voice still rings in our ears. Your moms might be far away like mine is today, and so I had to plan ahead to try to make sure I send a card and to talk to my mom. And your moms might be here today or in the community, and you might be getting together with them. There are many ways to honor our moms today. Sometimes they like chocolate or flowers or just your presence. And the scriptures today also mention something we all need to do. Listen to our moms. She has much to offer you. Mother's Day is a fun way to just take a little time to honor those who we cherish. And by doing this, we honor the God who created mothers. And I know that today you can put a smile both on your mother's face and on the face of God. And so take time to honor your moms. And worship team, please come up and lead us in some closing music.